I love reading. There are many different reasons why I like reading. It helps me feel better, concentrate on some positive things, but it also gives me an opportunity to travel or escape, experience the world, and get the skills that I want. Because I choose the books I want to read myself, or I listen to the advice of my friends, or I come across some information on the internet. The freedom of choice is important when you read, when you choose what to read. And back in Soviet times, the choice of books was very limited, and the majority of them were extremely ideological. I remember one book from my grandma's library that was about food. It was a recipe book, and almost each recipe began with an ideological introduction of how good it is to live in the Soviet Union. One of the most reading nations, Soviet people, were obliged to read what the party told them. Soviet Union loved competitions. Sometimes it seems to me that the USSR itself was created to participate in various competitions and to pretend that it is the land of all possible achievements. One of the very popular myths that sometimes is still reported in various media is that the USSR was the most reading nation in the world. Why do we have that fact? Because back in the 1950s there came an international research that demonstrated an average Soviet citizen spent 11 hours per week reading books. And it was twice more than an average citizen of the USA, Britain or France, which led to the appearance of this myth that Soviet people were the most reading people in the world, and as a result, one of the most educated. To debunk this myth, let's look into the history. At the very beginning of the USSR, there were lots and lots of illiterate people. A good thing happened, lots of civil schools were organized and people were made to learn how to read and how to write. But they did not spend much time at the schools, quickly returned to the factories and plants or collective farms and forgot the knowledge they received. So, Krupskaya, who was the widow of Lenin and was pretty influential in this cultural and educational field of the early USSR, started writing articles that we have to save the situation and we have to develop the network of libraries, because people who work on plants, who are poor, won't spend much money on buying books, and we have to offer these books for free. And very quickly, because in the Soviet Union all the orders were performed really quickly, a network of libraries appeared. More than 150,000 various libraries existed in the big country. And people were forced to come to these libraries, which was not bad at the beginning. All the hospitals, schools, various organizations were made to give separate spaces, separate rooms for the organization of libraries and the encouragement of people to read. It goes without saying that reading is good. It is one of the best habits that humanity developed. But when we look at what Soviet people were reading at this time, there will be a huge problem, because the majority of the books were ideological. And if you analyze a typical family library, even in the 70s or in the 80s, or even if I look at the library that was left after my grandparents, we will see a standard set of books, the majority of which will be various political books describing the history, the development of the Communist Party, memoirs of communist leaders or foreign communist leaders, lots of books by Lenin, Stalin and co, and maybe some books of Western leftists, books with fairy tales from various corners of the world, and lots of non-fiction about the Second World War or the Russian Revolution. Not very interesting to read for a wide majority of people. And the problem is that in those networks of libraries, in the shops or elsewhere, people did not have much choice. And traditionally, they were reading only ideological books. To find a detective or an adventurous book was pretty difficult, and a person had to fulfill a number of complicated steps to be able to buy the book he or she really wants to read but not must read. So what was the most reading nation in the world actually reading? The majority of the books were ideological books. Even those that represented fiction were spread with various ideological communist ideas. Honestly, when I look at the books that were printed back in that time, it is impossible to find a recipe book or a medical book or a linguistic book without a huge pack of various ideological ideas. Then there were lots of taboo topics and many books that were forbidden for reading, for publishing, and their authors were repressed, were taken to prisons, gulags, or even executed. That is a huge tragedy, and for Ukraine, we can even speak about the whole generation of writers that were killed during the 30s. Another part is that you have to possess a huge number of books written by famous political leaders. For example, the works of Lenin were published, and like his works, the collection of his works comprised 50 volumes, and the edition, the number of copies was close to 500,000, which is a lot for this kind of literature, even if you are in love with your political leader. But people were supposed to buy such books to keep them at home, at their working places, and to demonstrate their respect and to quote such books. Sometimes it was even impossible to buy an adventurous book without an ideological book coming together with it. So when you come to a bookstore, to be able to buy a detective story, you have to also buy, I don't know, a volume of Lenin. In the 70s, another idea appeared, which is good from the green perspective, but also connected closely to the communist ideology. And that is the new possibility to buy books that you want only after you collect waste paper. How did it work in reality? Imagine that you are an ordinary Soviet teenager and you want to buy a book by Fenimore Cooper or a detective story or something like that. You cannot come to a bookstore and buy these editions directly. You can only have access to them with a specific ticket that you receive after giving back to your country a number of waste paper. So it was very common for children, teenagers, and other people to collect as many waste paper as possible, give it to special points of collection, then receive tickets that allow you access to more interesting books. From one point of view, it's good from this green perspective and collecting waste paper, but from the other point of view, it did not allow people to buy books they want directly. And there are lots of cases described in media when people, for example, went to the shop, bought 50 volumes of Lenin's works, which were really heavy, then directly from the bookstore brought these volumes to the collection point of waste paper, received their ticket, and bought a book of Fenimore Cooper. And we see it is all the imitation of normality, a typical feature of the Soviet society. In the 70s, it became popular to subscribe to various editions of books and to collect them and put them into bookcases, so that the guests that come to visit you see the number of books that you are reading. But the focus here, once again, was not on the things that you enjoyed, but on the things that were popular or were difficult to get in Soviet society. Because the deficit is one of the words that must be associated with the USSR, and the deficit on books and information was always present. So these bookcases were used as window screens demonstrating the wealth and connections of a particular family. Many books that were popular were forbidden. And control was always really strong in the capitals, in large industrial centers, but many peripheral zones, for example, Asian Soviet republics or Moldova, became the centers of illegal publishing. And many interesting, rebellious, foreign books were published secretly in that places. So for the majority of Soviets, it was interesting to have a trip to a place like that, not only from this tourist perspective, but also because it gave a possibility to buy some interesting or some illegal books. Also, it led to the appearance of the black market. And many of you in comments tell me that you have read the Archipelago Gulag by Solzhenitsyn. It was impossible to buy this book in a Soviet bookstore, but it was possible to find it on a black market, and sometimes people even had to choose a different name to ask for a work, calling it, for example, a mystery island or something like that, not to get caught, not to get persecuted for reading what you actually want. People did not have much choice of what to read. So actually, it did not matter how much time they spent over these books, because they were fed up with ideology, political memoirs, and war nonfiction. The access to the information you want is always forbidden in totalitarian societies. Censorship, massive repressions, taboo topics, executed writers, limited choice, and 50 volumes of Lenin almost in every flat. This is the reality of Soviet literature. Let me know, would you like to know more about Soviet literature? We can dedicate a separate episode to that. Because at the very beginning of the USSR, party invested a lot in professional socialist writers. Yes, such people existed. And today, when we look at Russia, I sometimes try to find their intellectuals, writers, for example, who speak against war in Ukraine. Because one of the arguments that Russia actively uses during this war in Ukraine, fighting to restore its positive image, it says that a huge and very important Russian culture, Russian literature, Russian music. And I always have this question: can you name me popular, influential, and free Russian writers, modern Russian writers, not those who died back in the 19th century? And the answer is no, because totalitarian, authoritarian Russian regime, the continuation of the Soviet regime, destroys creativity, freedom, and free thinking. That is what we are fighting for right now in Ukraine. My name is Anna, and I want to tell you more about the beautiful country Ukraine and our dark past in the USSR.